Make good choices, people. The people of the internet are going to be very interested. All right.
Good morning, Mr. Richard.
Good afternoon, Chris. You guys have one more minute. Anything before we get started, you have one more minute. Mr. Richards is fine. What? You can call me Professor Richards if you want. That's fine. You what? Sorry, what? No, I'm not. It's 100%. You can do what you want. All right. You will be responsible for it. That seems inappropriate. What? That one is fine after you graduate. Oh, try to do one at a time if you would, just because of school rules, but otherwise I don't care. Oh, the class I teach at Marquette is, I think it's Theology 2400 Christian Discipleship. Yes, that's fine. Although he did ask, and I do want to clarify with that one, if you can please, like the school policy is still one at a time, right? So look and see if one of your classmates is there. I know, and I'm fine with it. It doesn't bother me. I'm just saying if you guys, listen, if you get yelled at by admin, there's nothing I can do to stop you on this one, okay? I won't be able to help you. But the other thing is, part of the whatever you need to do means if you're starting to get sleepy, stand up, lean against the wall, move around, stretch out. That's fine. All right. Remember, the responsibility of this information is yours, okay? I already know this stuff. I don't need to take a test on this. So you are going to be responsible for the information. So whatever you need to do to be responsible for that information is up to you. Can you use a table? No, sorry. No. Somebody else asked that too. What are you mad about? What? Yeah, you can sleep there if you want. Do it where it's not distracting for me. SheRichards@augprep.com or gregory.richards@marquette.edu. All right. What? I teach one class. Let's go. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start in prayer. So join me in praying. Body having, faith keeping, promise making God, we embark onto the strange journey of ethics and morality, sometimes so sure of our own rightness and sometimes so unsure of ourselves. We trust that the only real way to live life is the life that you live in the incarnation of Jesus, who is the way. Fix our eyes upon you and mark our paths with wisdom, discernment, courage, and faith. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so if you're looking for a title for the lecture, somebody already asked me. Our lecture today is the Introduction to Christian Ethics. And at the outset, I just so you know where I'm coming from, this is my goal for this lecture. My goal is not to help you make up your minds about Jesus. I do not believe or live as though Jesus is one good option between a bunch of other equally good options. My goal is to demonstrate over and over again that a life devoted to following Jesus is actually the best way to live, or maybe even more accurately, the only way to live. I'll say that one more time. This is what we're trying to do this semester, over the course of the semester. My goal is to demonstrate that a life devoted to following Jesus is the best way to live. I believe that's the primary truth and fundamental task of Christian ethics, which we will get into in a second. All right. If that's true, though, does that mean that we can't be friends if we disagree on this? If you think there's other ways to do it, or Jesus maybe isn't what I think Jesus is? No. I think we can still be friends. We can just disagree well. And hopefully we'll model that and demonstrate that as the semester goes on. I just want to make clear that I'm laying my cards on the table right up front so that you know I'm not trying to trick you into something. I just want you to know that I think that's who Jesus is. I think that's what Christian ethics is about. And if you agree, great. If you disagree, that's fine. I have a lot of friends I disagree with. All right. To further build on that, the idea that you are free beings capable of choosing your own story, right, that you can decide if Jesus is right or not, that idea is part of a philosophical system called modernity. We're not going to explore that right now, but we will come back to it later. You just need to know it's not true. You do not get to choose this kind of stuff. You've been placed in a culture. You've been raised by people who believe things, who make you believe things. You are never free in this kind of free way that you sometimes imagine you are. We're going to come back to that later on. All right. That's less lecture-y. This is more lecture-y. Christian ethics is part of a giant system called philosophy. All right. Philosophy is the study of wisdom. Philos or philo in Greek is wisdom. Philosophy is the study of wisdom. Sometimes you'll hear philosophy called the study of knowledge. That's fine. Wisdom is I like a little better. I think it fits what we do a little better and it makes a little bit more sense. We don't need all knowledge. We're not studying everything that's ever been learned. But the wisdom of people we do care about, right? And we're going to look at a lot of different ways of thinking and talking about wisdom. Within philosophy, there are four major branches. There is metaphysics. There is epistemology. There is logic. And then the one we're going to be primarily concerned about, there's ethics. All right? So in a nutshell, in really simple ways of talking about this, metaphysics is essentially concerned with the question about what is real. What is reality? What exists? That's metaphysics. Epistemology, which I spelled wrong, sorry. It's an I. Epistemology, wait, I might have spelled it right. Hold on. Sorry, guys. You don't have to be good at spelling to do this. All right, epistemology, it is an E. I was right the first time. All right, epistemology is how we know, right? How do you know what you know? 2 plus 2 is 4, right? Why? How? How do you know? You can prove it. You can look at stuff. You can count up M&Ms, whatever it is you come up with, right? But how do you know what's good? How do you know that you know things? That's epistemology, right? What kind of stuff can you know? What kind of ways? That's epistemology. Logic. Logic, the word we associate with logic is reason. And this is how we tell if something is a good argument or a bad argument, why something is true or not true, or how we could tell. This is where math lives for the most part. We study mathematics not because we love numbers necessarily. We study mathematics because it's part of logic, right? It's a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about the world. We don't usually teach math that way, and that's one of the reasons a lot of us suck at math. If we realized it wasn't about numbers, it would be a little easier to do. All right? Ethics. This is what we're going to look at, and this is essentially concerned with goodness. All right? What's the good life? What does it mean to be good? What are good choices or bad choices? That's ethics largely, in a huge nutshell, that's what ethics is. There are 2 more you should know. These 4 are the major ones. These are the traditional historical, this is what it is. There's 2 more smaller ones that sometimes when you get to college, you might run across professors who argue that these should be considered branches of philosophy because they've grown in importance lately. The first one is aesthetics, and this one's concerned about beauty. And so it wants to know, why are things beautiful? Like, why are some things beautiful and some things ugly? Right? Why do some things fit together and some things don't? And how can we tell that on the front end, right? Politics is how do we govern? That's usually the definition you get. You guys, probably when you think of politics, you think of like Washington, D.C. or the governor or the mayor or something like this. Those definitions of politics are fine, but I do want to tell you there's a better, bigger definition of politics, which we'll come back to later in the semester. And that bigger definition is just the way people interact with each other. This word politics comes from another word, polis, and it means people. It's how people interact with each other. So you think of like metropolises. If you ever hear that word metropolis, that's just a lot of people. That's what politics is about. It's about people and how people's lives intersect with each other, okay? So we'll come back to that later. Within these, in a technical sense, there are 8 schools of ethics. And when I say ethics, what I mean in this case is how do we determine what the good is, okay? I'm going to give you all 8 of these. You do not have to know all of these. That's not going to show up on a test. I just want you to kind of absorb them. If you want to jot 1 or 2 down, that's fine. If you want to jot 3 or 4 down, that's fine. Don't worry about trying to get all 8 down because I'm going to go too fast through them. All right, it's not the primary thing we're going to do today. We're still getting to that, but it is something that's just interesting to kind of know. All right, you have factors in your brain that help you determine if something is a good decision or a bad decision. This is what these schools of ethics are going to be about. So the 8 things we're going to look at are 8 ways of determining, is something a good decision or a bad decision? Is it good or bad? Is it right or wrong? Those are the questions the schools of ethics are going to try to answer. You have some of these already. Some of these you inherited. Some of you picked them up along the way. Some of them are cultural. All right? And we all have them, and we all have like some kind of mix of them. There's almost nobody in here, I can't imagine there's somebody in here who would only have one of these. All right, so when I read them, some of them are going to sound like, why would anybody do that? Or some of them are going to sound like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I hear that. Like this is, and some of you are going to be in situations where maybe your parents or adults in your life operate with one and you operate with another one. And that's why you guys fight about certain things, right? Because it's like you realize, oh, they think this is right because of this thing, but I'm operating out of this other set of choice making, right? And this is why it's different. So here's the first one, something called supernaturalism. It's a really, really easy one. This is the easiest one to understand probably. Supernaturalism is your God told you to do it, right? So why is it right or wrong? Because God said it. Okay, that settles that, right? So if you're somebody who believes in this version of this, you have some version of God that God tells you what to do or not do. If he tells you to do it and you do it, that's right. If he tells you to do it, he doesn't do it, that's wrong. If your God tells you to sacrifice children, right? That's supernaturalism. If your God tells you love your enemies, right? You do what your God tells you to do. That's one way to determine if it's right or wrong. Second one is something called subjectivism. Subjectivism means that you determine what's right or wrong, right? You have some bearing on yourself. Your choices are what's best for you, right? Is it right to sacrifice your children to the gods? No, they're my kids. I like them, right? I'm going to keep my kids. Your kids I might sacrifice. That's just because they irritate me and they're loud, right? But that's my choice. I get to determine if it's good or bad. And that doesn't come from the outside. That comes from me, right? What benefits me? Third one is something called consequentialism. This one's really, really important. This one's been enormously important in the history of the U.S. It's still important for us now. Consequentialism is hard to spell, but it means essentially the consequences determine if the choice is right or not, right? So you look at the choice ahead of time and you say, what happens if I do this? Do I like those consequences? If I do, I'll do the action. If I don't like those consequences, then I don't do the action, right? That's consequentialism. The most important version of consequentialism is something called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that if something works, it's the right thing to do, right? This has been true throughout history. What about slavery? Why keep slaves? Because they work, right? Every single nation in the history of the world has always had slaves. Why? It's a great system, right? Unless you happen to be a slave, then it's terrible, right? But there's a utility to it, right? Why work 8-hour days? Why have child labor? Why do all this stuff, right? Because it works. We're getting something out of it. That's the only reason we keep doing it. If it was bad for everybody, we'd all stop doing it, right? The consequences of the action determine if the action itself is good or not. That's one way of thinking about how to make these choices. The next one is something called intuitionism. All right? This is an idea that grows out of a very old philosophy, but the idea is really simply you just know what's right or wrong, right? That you've inherited it somewhere. It's universal. We all kind of know it's right. So we sort of know it's not right to sacrifice kids, right? So you don't kill kids because that would be dumb, right? We know intuitively that that's a bad choice, right? Now it gets murkier when it's not as obvious, right? But good choices, bad choices, it comes down to to your own intuition. The fifth one is something called emotivism. In emotivism, you are going to make the decision based on how you feel. This one is much more popular in your generation than it's been in other generations in history. A good decision makes you feel good. A bad decision makes you feel bad. So you make the decision that's going to make you feel good. Really simple, right? How do you determine if it's right or wrong? I don't know. What felt better in the moment, right? Now, There are still consequences. There's other things we got to worry about. But for the most part, this is just how we're going to make this choice. The sixth one is much more common in other cultures. It's much more common in olden days, right? This one is duty-based ethics. There are things you do because you're supposed to do them, right? Now, we don't love that one all the time, but I will say, just broad strokes on this one, as a white teacher or professor, this is much more common in cultures that are not my own, right? You guys come from cultures where some of this still holds on, that you do things because you're part of a family and this is how our family does it, right? You don't move out of the home until you get married, for example, or you maybe pick up extra jobs because this is what we do, right? Any of that kind of, this is what our family does. You've heard of like prearranged marriages and things like that. Those are good choices because they're duty bound. You do them because you're supposed to do them. If you ever get into like Japanese culture, or if you watch movies like Shogun or TV shows like that, there's any honor and shame based culture has a huge amount of this duty stuff, right? Or maybe more clearly, if you're a police officer or if you're in the military, right? These are duty ethics. You do them because the person above you told you to do them. It's your job, right? How many times have you seen somebody say, somebody do something awful and like, how could you do that? It's like, well, it's my job. Somebody told me to do it, right? Like I was commanded to do it. That's duty-based ethics. The seventh one is something called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is super, super important for me personally. This is what most of my education is in. When we get into this kind of stuff, this is the kind of ethics that I sort of got my master's degree in largely. Virtue ethics, we're going to come back to. This idea of virtue is you do the good because it's good, right? Like, which seems like circular, but there's a reason for this. You figure this out as a community throughout time, and then you keep practicing it. We're not going to go deep into that right now, but I'll come back to it. And I'll explain the logic of that one. The last one is something called situation ethics. This one's also incredibly popular. When you get to college, you will probably take a philosophy class at some point, and when you do, you will probably take something like situation ethics, or you will take business ethics at some point, or something like this. Most of the ethics classes you have will be situational ethics based. So, what is situational ethics? Pretty simple. The situation itself determines what's good or bad, right? So let me give you a silly example of this one so you can kind of get your head around it. Right now, if I get mad at Jose, and Jose gets mad at me, which would never happen because we like each other a ton, but if Jose gets mad at me, and he comes at me, and he punches me, is that allowed? Is that a good choice? No, right? That's a bad choice. However, if Jose and I are in a UFC ring, and he comes at me and punches me, is that allowed? Is that a good choice or a bad choice? It's a good choice then, right? What's different? The situation's different, right? So there are situations where it's okay for Jose to punch me, and there's situations where he should absolutely not punch me, right? All right, so the question becomes, do those situations actually determine what's good or bad, right? And so we use those situations all the time to try to make sense out of what choices we should make or what choices we should not make, all right? Those are different ethics. Those are different rationales for determining what's the good and what's not the good. You are not going to need to know all 8 of those, okay? I just want you to be aware that these are things people have thought about a lot that are just kind of like behind the scenes in your life that you do make choices out of without even realizing you're doing it, okay? Just be aware of them. Every once in a while we'll call them out. I'll point them out when they happen. But we're going to focus on some other stuff here. So if we have, essentially the big question here is if philosophy is the big picture umbrella, and we have these 8 schools of ethics inside of that, where does Christian ethics fit? Right? What makes ethics Christian? Can any of those 8 be Christian? Is there a specific one that's Christian? Is Christian something totally off to the side? Let's answer it this way. A very simple definition of Christian ethics is this. Christian ethics are Christian to the degree that they submit to the normativity of Jesus. I'm going to say this again because I want you to get this one word for word. All right, this is one of the sentences I want you to write down. Christian ethics are Christian to the degree that they submit to the normativity of Jesus. I'll go one more time because it's a lot of words and they're longer. Christian ethics are Christian to the degree that they submit to the normativity of Jesus. If you don't have that written down, somebody else in the class will have it written down by this point. 3 times is pretty good. And I get tired of hearing the same one over and over again. Does at least one person have this written down already?
Yeah.
Pretty close? Okay, perfect. All right, we will come back to that at the end if you need that one more time. Don't do it now. Grab it at the end, guys. We'll get it later. Because I want you to know what it means. All right, so to unpack this a little bit, when I say normativity of Jesus, that phrase, I mean this. Jesus is the standard, the rule, and the measure of any ethical teaching. So what is good, right? Ethics is asking that question. We gave you 8 schools that told you what good might be. Here's the answer to that question. Jesus. Christian ethics answers every single time, Jesus is the good, right? So in as much as something looks like Jesus, and by Jesus I mean his teachings or his life, then it's good. And if it doesn't look like Jesus, or the further it is away from Jesus, the less good it is, okay? So our definition of Christian ethics is really simply that Jesus is normative, all right? He is the standard, the measure, the mark of what goodness is. He's the definition of goodness. And so to the degree that we move away from the teachings and life of Jesus, we're moving away from goodness. We're moving away from a Christian ethic. Okay? So, let's think about that for just a second. So generally speaking, that's kind of how it works. If Jesus' life and teaching are the standard, if they're the norm, then I have a couple of hot takes for you here. If they're the norm and Jesus is goodness, then it might be possible that a song like, I don't know, Olivia Rodrigo's Driver's License, for example, might actually be more Christian in this way than something like I Can Only Imagine, right? It's possible. You can make that argument. Or maybe a better example of this is that if Jesus' life and teaching is a standard for what's good or not, then Disney movies, some of your favorite Disney movies, might be the least Christian films ever made, right? Because they're the furthest away from Jesus. We can unpack that one later if it really bothers you. Okay, so why talk about this at all, right? We're going to deal with Christian ethics the rest of this semester. That's what this class is. But why does any of it matter? Why do we teach an entire class on this? Why do I have a master's degree in it, right? Because Jesus is the norm. And so here's the deal. In the history of the church has screwed this up over and over and over again. And by church, I just mean people who follow Jesus, right? Like, not any specific church at any specific time. Christians have not always followed Jesus' teaching on almost anything. We've been really, really bad at it. So here's what we're going to spend some time on now in this next section. This is the last section that we're going to go through, okay? And this is what I want us to really kind of dial into. Why don't we take Jesus seriously for Christian ethics? Why, as Christians, as the church, why do we ignore Jesus' teaching on ethics? All right. I think there are 8 reasons. I didn't make these reasons up. A Mennonite writer named John Howard Yoder came up with these, but I think he's right. These are at least 8 of them, and I think these initially kind of set us up to make sense of this. So what we're going to talk about now is 8 ways we don't make Jesus normative, right? I said a Christian ethic is a Christian ethic because of how close it is to Jesus. I think there's ways when Jesus tells us what to do, when Jesus gives us ethics and ways we ought to make choices, we just don't like them. And so because of that, we don't actually follow Jesus on this stuff. And when that's the case, I want to explain a little bit why that is. So here are 8 ways to ignore Jesus as normative, right? The 8 ways to ignore Jesus as our standard. The first one is this. We might call this one temporary Jesus. These 8 ways are really important, and I want to make sure you get these down, okay? Because these ones we're going to use in our next unit almost immediately. So, the first one is temporary Jesus. In the situation with temporary Jesus, the argument goes like this. Jesus was alive, right? We all agree. Jesus lived. He lived for 30 years, and he died. And he was resurrected. He went into heaven. And at no point in that time did he assume he was going to be gone in heaven for thousands of years. There's actually some really good Bible verses to back this one up. If you read certain spots in the Gospels, Jesus says, I'll return to you quickly, right? Or I'll come back for you, these kinds of things, right? So the argument is Jesus wasn't setting up an ethic that we're meant to follow 2,000 years later, right? What he was really doing was just talking to his disciples and telling them how they should live until he comes back, right? With the assumption that the coming back part was going to happen really, really fast. What he meant to do was help his disciples right then, and it has nothing really to do with how you ought to live right now, right? So you might be able to build an ethical system that's about goodness, but it doesn't need to be Jesus as the standard of it, because Jesus isn't telling you to follow him for the next 2,000 years. He was telling his disciples what to do until they died, and that was kind of it. All right? That's temporary Jesus. That's an argument that you will see Christians make sometimes. All right. Another argument for ignoring Jesus, this is the second one. Another way we misread Jesus sometimes is something we'll call farm boy Jesus. In farm boy Jesus, it goes like this. Jesus was essentially a rural figure. He grew up not in a city, right? He never saw fit to involve himself in the political systems of his day. He never got involved in local politics, and he certainly never seemed to speak against the vast networks of relationships and institutions that make up the political climate, right? He just didn't get involved in that stuff. He lived for 33 years. He spent almost no time talking about this at all. What Jesus did was he lived. He lived in the backwoods town in the middle of a backwoods country that Rome didn't really even care about. He just wasn't that important. He became important later on for us, but at the time, farm boy Jesus, he just stuck to the stuff that he knew, right? He wasn't concerned about politics or ethics. You don't need to get involved in that if you follow Jesus. That's the second argument. Again, these are bad arguments, right? These are ways I'm going to try to argue against the rest of the semester, but I want you to hear them now. The third one is what we'll call powerless Jesus. And this is connected to that last one, but it's a little bit different. This option is that Jesus never had any political power, right? He lived in a country of people who were oppressed, who didn't have the power to get out of that oppression. And so he didn't have any actual power, but you don't live in that context, right? You're not oppressed the way Jesus was oppressed. Your country is not occupied the way Jesus' country was occupied. You have a totally different set of political powers that Jesus never even imagined. So you should be using those, right? So what Jesus tells you about this stuff doesn't apply to you the same way because you're in an entirely different context. You have other ways to engage. Jesus didn't have any of that stuff, so the idea that you could ask Jesus to tell you how to engage the stuff now is ludicrous. Why would you even think that could happen? The fourth one is what we'll call spiritual Jesus. And this one, in my opinion, is the worst one. But this is one you guys are going to recognize, I think, if you've gone to churches. And it goes like this. That there is an inwardness, there is a spiritualness of faith, right? There's a spiritualness in your following of Jesus, and it's that spiritualness and only that spiritualness that Jesus is concerned about. So Jesus is primarily concerned with our hearts, and Jesus is really about what affects our hearts and what doesn't. And he doesn't really care nearly as much about what you do with your lives or what you do with your bodies, things that politics and ethics are concerned about. What Jesus cares about is your soul or your heart, and that's it. So by all means, do what else you want, but believe the right stuff, right? Pray to Jesus once in a while. But you could pray to Jesus and also cheat on your girlfriend or something. This is spiritual Jesus, right? That your faith and your works are radically separate things. What you believe and what you do are not the same thing. And so because of that radical spiritualizing, Jesus simply doesn't tell or have anything to share with you about physical, political, or ethical lives, right? That's not what he's concerned about. He's only concerned about your heart. The next one, the fifth one, is what we might call theological Jesus. This one on the surface doesn't seem as bad, but it gets bad pretty fast. We looked at this last semester. We talked about theology and what it means to study God, but we also recognize that there's a radical discontinuity. There's a radical difference between God and humanity, right? That God is holy. Remember, we went through this whole thing about God being holy, holy, holy. And when we talk about God's holiness, that's so different than us. Right? God is transcendent. God is beyond us. When we say the word God, we're not saying man in a loud voice. Right? We used all these quotes last semester. So this argument goes, because God is so different from us and Jesus is God, we can't be expected to do the things Jesus did, right? That would be ridiculous. We can't do what God can do. It's not realistic or fair to even ask us to do that. Because Jesus is God and Jesus is perfect, we're flawed people who live flawed lives. There's no perfect ethic, and because there's no perfect ethic, then Jesus cannot give us an ethic at all, right? Because he's perfect. So he can't give us an unperfect ethic. Because Jesus couldn't give us a flawed human ethic, that's the sort of argument. Jesus doesn't command us. Rather, he encourages us to live up to our potential, maybe, right? In hopes that we can kind of be saved at the end of the day. That moves us to number 6. Number 6 is the other one that you might be even more familiar with. And this is what we'll call sacrificing Jesus. This picture of Jesus emphasizes the truth that Jesus came as a gift, right? God's presence with us in Jesus is a gift and is a grace. And this means you shouldn't take that gift and make it an obligation for things you have to do, right? If it becomes an obligation, it's not grace anymore. If Jesus is the gift of God for us, and he's rescued us through his own sacrificial life, what are we doing turning that into an ethic that you have to follow, right? The very nature of the gift should mean you don't have to do things because of it, right? That's how it's supposed to work. Jesus can't command us or tell us what to do because he's here as a grace. He's a gift. So the idea that he could give us a gift and also command us at the same time is paradoxical, and it can't both be true. That's the argument for number 6. Number 7, we're almost there, guys. I've got 2 more, and then we're done. 2 more in a story, and we're finished. The next one is foggy Jesus. This is not the idea that Jesus himself doesn't know what he's doing. The idea here is that we can't. That there's something called the 2,000-year-old ditch between us and Jesus. History has existed for 2,000 years since Jesus, and the idea that you could build an entire ethic of what's good and bad over and over and over again based on what little information we have about Jesus is insane, right? Like, why would you possibly do that? We have maybe 40 pages of text about Jesus from the first century. What we have is the Gospels and a few outside sources that reference Jesus. Is that enough to build your entire life on? That seems wild, right? That seems like building your entire life on like one magazine. That's the length of what we have from history. How does that work? That doesn't make sense, right? The accounts we have are sparse and at times even contradictory and inherently biased. This is certainly no way to build a coherent set of ethical actions. And I want you to catch this point, because the idea is Jesus might be okay to follow as an ethical example. You'll hear people say that, but we don't even really all the way know who Jesus was. He lived 33 years and we don't know anything from like year 2 to year 30. What do we do with that, right? The giant gap between when Jesus lived and us is too big for us to jump over with ethics. All right, and the last one is, I came up with this title, but it's something like overly important Jesus. And this is a weird argument, so I don't know that you guys have ever been to churches that would make this argument or run across this. But the argument here is that Jesus is part of the Trinity. We've talked about this before too, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so if we pay too much attention to Jesus, we're somehow ignoring the other 2 members of the Trinity. So to make Jesus the normative standard for ethics means we are not making anything else that standard, right? So we're separating Jesus out from the Father and the Son in a way that's unhealthy and dangerous for our ethics. Those are 8 ways, okay? Those are 8 ways of thinking about Jesus that I think are wrong, but I think we default to when we run into really tough readings of Jesus. So I'm going to give you an example of this. This is our test case for this, and then I'll tell you a story, and then we'll be done. So if you think of this, we read a story today, right? We read a story today where Jesus tells somebody, sell everything you have and give to the poor. So what does he mean? Does he mean you should actually sell everything you have and give to the poor? Is that our ethic, right? Well, first question is, does Jesus sell everything he has and gives to the poor? Yeah, right? Every account we have of Jesus says that he literally had nothing. Okay, so Jesus does that. He tells other people to do it. He tells his disciples to do it. Does he mean it? Do you think 2,000 years later that means you have to sell everything you have and give it to the poor? All right? The answer might be no, but why? Right? Those 8 I just gave you are different ways of answering Jesus on this. Right? So I say, Jesus says, sell everything and give to the poor. Okay, that sounds great, except for, guess what? I don't want to do it. Right? It seems impractical. So let's talk about how I can get around it. Well, this is how we end up using these, right? So when he says give everything you have, he doesn't really mean take out your wallet and give money to people who ask for it, does he? What he means is in your heart, don't be attached to money. That's spiritual Jesus, right? That's that version of reading Jesus that we just talked about. Or we might call that Jesus even like guru Jesus or something, right? This is the Jesus who will just give you good advice. Or maybe Jesus gives us a principle, like be generous, right? Maybe the point isn't give everything you have to the poor, but to be as generous as you can be without it ruining your life. But that's not what Jesus actually said, right? That's not what he actually did. This is to turn Jesus' teaching into some kind of principle, and this is what we might call theological Jesus, right? If you look at that misreading of Jesus. And we can do this over and over and over again. Or maybe Jesus is here, he's interesting, he's actually getting, what he teaches about money actually gets trumped later on by Paul's teaching about money or later church teaching about money, because Jesus didn't intend the command to last that long, right? That's temporary Jesus. So you can see how that works. Jesus gives his disciples a command, but later on the church says, I didn't really mean it, right? That's not how it works. That's temporary Jesus. Maybe money wasn't what money is now, right? Maybe it's an interpretation problem. Maybe there's something else getting in the way of this. That's foggy Jesus. Or maybe Jesus said it because he was concerned about that guy's soul, but he's not really concerned about how money affects your soul, right? Because that's not who Jesus is. It's not what he really cares about. What he really cares about is your soul and getting you into heaven. That's sacrificing Jesus, right? Or maybe we can protect ourselves and our money by admitting that Jesus wouldn't know much about money anyway because he never had any. He started off poor. He died poor. How in the world would he know what to do with your 401k? Jesus didn't have a stock market. He didn't know any good bankers. He didn't charge interest. He didn't really understand how money works. Because if he understood how money works, then maybe he would have used it. This is powerless Jesus, right? Or maybe this is farm boy Jesus. You sort of get the idea, right? Each of these gives us loopholes and ways out of just conceding that Jesus is the norm for us. So here's my contention. Any given church that you're ever a part of is going to have one of these as a general default, at least one, right? Because as a church, we get this wrong every time. Because Jesus is called to be our norm and our standard for Christian ethics, and we don't like what Jesus teaches most of the time on a lot of this stuff. So we have to try to figure out how to live. And given that, what it means is we make something Jesus says that's really obvious, really difficult to understand. So when Jesus stands in front of his people, when he stands in front of the people around him and he says, give everything you have to the poor, do we give everything we have to the poor? No. We make it something else, right? We make it a principle, or we make it an idea, or we add a thing around it, right? It's like, well, maybe Jesus didn't really mean that, or maybe he did mean that, or maybe he was, maybe it was okay for Jesus to do that, but he doesn't want us to do that. He wants us to keep as much as we can keep so we can take care of our family. Whatever he comes up with, we have reasons to ignore Jesus on that stuff. All right, this is a story I told you I would end on. It's a really simple story. When I was, before Colette was even born, I used to stay home with my kids. I had 2 sons older than her. I used to stay home with both of them. And their favorite thing to do, we lived in this really small apartment. And there were 6 places to hide in this entire apartment. And they loved to play hide and seek. And it got so boring because there's only 6 places to hide, right? So it's like, as a dad, you're like, oh gosh, this is getting irritating. So eventually, I just stayed on the couch. I said, go count and then come find me. And I would just sit on the couch. What I realized, the first few times I did that, they could never find me. Because I wasn't in one of those 6 places, right? I'd managed to hide wide open in front of them, but they assumed I had to be hidden somewhere, so they couldn't find it. That's how this works with Jesus. Jesus sometimes is so obvious and so in front of us that we miss it because we think it has to be something else. So when Jesus says, give everything you have to the poor, there's a chance he's just standing right in the middle of the room and you're missing him because you're looking in the closet over here or you're looking behind the shower curtain over here for spiritual Jesus or theological Jesus or whatever, right? The point is, he might just be saying the obvious thing right in front of you. We're going to come back to that because we're going to build on this as we go when we look at the Sermon on the Mount next unit. All right, that's what I've got for us. Does anybody have any questions or things I need to hit on one more time to make sure you have it? All right, you guys did awesome. Thank you. I know it's hard. It's late in the day, all that stuff, but you guys crushed it. So go ahead back in your scoreboards. Go ahead and open your scoreboards. Your notes for today are worth 10, so you can put 10 there, but you don't get those 10 yet. You'll get them on Friday, okay? Once I look over your notes on Friday. If you're missing things that you want to get, talk to each other, right? That's the idea. Check everybody else's notes and make sure you're not missing anything big. I do not need the commentary, ladies.
Wait, where do you see it? You want us to turn it off? Do you keep it? Bye, guys. Make sure you comment down
Yes,
below.
you can turn it. Yeah, subscribe and comment. Thank you. Thanks, Yo-Yo. Turn it off.